Based on our recent compliance guide, some interesting stats came to light, including 60% of businesses cite the key compliance challenge as online education fatigue, 71% of people say that they believe their compliance could be improved, and compliance is seen as a task rather than a learning opportunity. So the challenge seems to be that compliance courses are sending more people asleep than not, as a result of these programs being not positioned properly and not supporting genuine change. So how can compliance be more engaging and make behavioral change with a blended approach? Today, your presenter, Tina Griffin, Learning Solutions Manager from our Wellington team, will be looking at how to solve these challenges. Today's webinar will be 30 minutes in length to keep things snappy. So please post your questions as we go along in the question pane, and we'll endeavor to answer them towards the end of the session. At the conclusion of today's webinar, we'll be emailing you with the webinar recording and slide deck, along with a copy of our compliance blended learning guide that you can see on your screen right now. And we'll share with you the number of ways you can connect with Kineo to receive the latest L&D news, compliance tips, updates, and much more. So who is Kineo? Kineo is a leading workplace learning company that helps businesses improve their performance through learning and technology. As part of the City & Guilds Kineo Group, we currently have over 200 experienced staff spread out in Kineo offices in 8 different countries, supporting over 200 blue-chip clients such as Rio Tinto, CBA, Warner Brothers, Tesco, BP, Nikon, McDonald's, the list goes on. We can provide the full range of services to design and deliver your learning programs. Our services include LMS and learning portals using Totara LMS, consultancy and capability building, blended program design and development, custom rapid and multi-device e-learning development design, as well as marketing awareness. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome to the virtual stage Tina Griffin.
Thank you, Georgia. Great, so hi everybody, I'm Tina Griffin. Sorry, I'll just change onto my screen in a second. With me, here I am. It's strange looking at myself. I've been working with Kineo since about 2009 and have seen a huge growth in e-learning, and in the last few years quite a lot of blended learning. I've been working in the field of e-learning for something like 17 years, so have certainly seen it go through the many phases. And, you know, really excited today to talk about some of those trends and what's been emerging, and certainly my experience in blended learning around compliance. So again, with no further ado, I want to pose a question to you guys out there. And I guess you're here because you are thinking about compliance learning for your organisation. And my question is really, if you had to pick one of these, you know, what is the main focus of your compliance learning? So Georgia will in a minute, should be able to see the poll at this point in time. Great. And I can see if we give you, what have we got? Give you another 5 seconds. Come on, who's going to decide? Oh, it's really changing. Oh, it's splitting. It's very interesting to watch. If you guys can open up and see the poll. Okay, great. We can maybe call that a halt. Thank you. So what I can see there is definitely about a quarter of you, 22%, are saying, look, we're still in that field of needing to tick the box. Compliance learning is something we have to do, and really we're not sort of probably going to spend too much effort on it. But also really great to see that a number of you are understanding that there are some kind of key behaviour changes that are underlying some of your compliance learning. And so I suppose in kind of talking to, thinking about the blend is really where we're going to start trying to address some of those behaviour changes. Great, thank you. So, in thinking about compliance and training, I guess when we went out and had a look at and interviewed a number of organisations, and this really went right around the world. And we gathered some stories and some anecdotes from what people were actually saying about compliance. And really, there are 3 key points, and I'll kind of be talking about those today. So first point was organisations were saying with their compliance training, why hasn't it worked? Well, it hasn't been positioned right. And so in speaking to that, we'll talk a little bit about, how do we get people to care? How do we get them to, understand why it's important to them? How do we get the tone right? How do we make it personal? And some other things that we can do to really get that positioning right. The second issue was they're saying, well, our compliance learning just isn't actually designed that well. Again, we'll talk a little bit about how you can design to really engage your audiences, some of the things that you can do around stories, practice, providing context and resources and making things memorable. And then finally, and again speaking to you guys that answered that poll around the changing behaviour, they said compliance learning out there at the moment just isn't really supporting the change. And again, that's been kind of a big focus, I think, for Kineo and the clients we're working with around how can we do something that sustains the messages, that involves managers and involves all the resources in your organisation and kind of keeps those messages alive over a period of time. So how do we get people to care? And at the heart of this is, we want our learners to understand why they're doing the learning. And if we want to go beyond, ticking a box, we need to kind of pull people in. We need to give them why this content is important and drive them to think about that and do something different. And if you think about a common example that I come across is something like legislation. And what often happens in our compliance legislation training is we talk about legislation and the words and what they say. And we don't actually think about what is the impact on the learner and why does the learner actually need to know this legislation. And for me, that comes down to really having a robust analysis phase where you're really thinking about your learners and all of your learners and all the possible makeups of those learner groups. I think asking 3 key questions will help you kind of address the why. The first one is, how will staff need to comply? So understanding what are those situations of what are they actually doing when they are complying? How do they not comply right now? So what are they doing wrong? What are the behaviours that we might need to correct? And what do they think they're doing and complying, but they're actually not complying? So that's very much about the misconceptions. So trying to get a really good understanding of the learner context will really help us understand and get people to care. And as an example here, we break an audience down. This was for a bank, again, breaking it down into their subgroups because, again, every context was very different for each of those subgroups and providing real examples. So context is something that can help us get to the heart of, answering that why question. And we really want to make it human. So we are all storytellers from many, many, many generations back. We know that stories are actually very sticky and quite powerful. And if we can put a human face on something that is compliance, we're going to get that much further to really making an impact on learning. So I think there are a number of ways you can make things human. Consequences are kind of important. And stories that tell of failure. If we can send a message out to our learners going, hey, let's learn from our mistakes. And selling failures and stories can often be quite a hard sell for organisations that can make something very powerful. It may be capturing stories of, I'll call them skeptics to believers, whether that's interviewing people in your organisation or just kind of telling those case study stories. And ultimately, we're trying to, by making it human, connect with the human learner. And we want to get those learners to say, phew, thank goodness that wasn't me, and I'll make sure I avoid, doing that, so that will never happen to me. And that's ultimately our goal in compliance. We want people to comply. So anything that we can do to try and make it real for them. So here's an example of sharing war stories, being willing to, these were headline news, and show the actual impact and share those stories. And then another piece which is really important and kind of connecting to the why is thinking about grey areas. So my experience, particularly with compliance, the black and the white are easy. If we say this is fraudulent behaviour and this is not fraudulent behaviour, people are generally okay with being able to differentiate. So I think we're talking about trying to focus on the grey, because that tends to be where the errors or the misconceptions occur. So again, trying to get scenarios that are really rich and interesting. We want people to sit up and pay attention, so trying to make them both real, but also sitting in the grey area with very robust feedback. And getting people involved. So here's an example of a course where we ask participants to just kind of rate their confidence. And this is very much about trying to actually make them a little bit uncomfortable, to perhaps confront some of the things that they don't know, to identify their own sort of gaps in their knowledge. And in a blended program, that can kind of set you up to a range of resources that may then support a piece of learning around it. So thinking not just about modules, but also thinking about some of those follow-up activities. So around the compliance area, it may be as simple as, have a conversation with your manager or discuss any issues with your manager. It may be an activity that we get people to do, to review some resources, or a particular coaching activity that they might need to do. And then likewise campaign elements, and we'll talk about that again a little bit later. But campaign elements can kind of keep those ideas alive. So again, we're just trying to bring humans into a concept and around the area of compliance. And so the second point was, well, look, how can we actually design for engagement? No, not that type of engagement. So what we're trying to do is kind of use these stories and that humanity to really engage people in a meaningful way. And one of the conversations I have a lot with people who are designing e-learning, which is, what does that word engagement actually mean? And there are many, many aspects to engagement, but I think often what we get caught up in is, if I'm clicking a next button, therefore I must be engaged because I'm doing something with my fingers. And if we step back and say, look, actually this is about engaging our minds. Is this piece of compliance learning making me think? Am I engaging their hearts? So is this piece of compliance learning making me feel bad, feel good, feel something that might be thinking about changing my behaviour? Or is this learning some kind of call to action? Is it asking me to do something, or go on and do something, or change my behaviour? So again, thinking about that design for engagement. And, one of the great ways of doing that is with stories. Here's an example of a graphic novel. And again, we are often challenged with organisations saying, oh, I don't want to do that, that looks childish, and I don't want to dumb down, this is compliance, this is important stuff, people really need to do this, and it would be silly. And I think there's a fine balance that you need to tread around compliance topics that's going to work for your organisation. But I think taking people out of the context can be a really powerful way to get them to engage with content, makes it more interesting. And stories, again, people will remember stories. One of the things I usually say is we need to just suspend reality. It's what we do in movies a lot. We can sit in the movie and know that something is not real, but still take the messages away. So I think the same thing can be applied to our compliance learning to make it engaging. And getting people involved. So again, this is about scenarios and stories and creating interest around everything that you do. We could, in this case, this was a a course about social media policies. And, you know, in this case, we could have just presented, these are our policies and this is what you need to do, and given them some little examples. But instead, they had a series of case files and they had to go and solve a case. So again, it's about making things engaging, treating people as adults, and actually assuming that there's a core level of understanding and knowledge, and if there isn't, that will be providing remedial feedback. And again, thinking outside of e-learning, that might be just as much engaging on their job activities that require some kind of solving or looking. I've seen a little bit, starting to see that a little bit here in New Zealand around using QR codes, getting people to go and find information, learn more information, getting them out into their organisation and seeing the application. You know, likewise, there can be a flow on to learner-generated content within this area where maybe somebody has to film themselves and upload that as an evidence of that area of compliance. And then giving learners a goal. So all of our scenario learning really needs to have some purpose. And this comes back to the why that we talked about early on. So giving people not just some information about it and saying, here you go, read it and you'll get it, but give them a situation in which they can practice. And that's about that kind of context around everything that we do. Again, thinking outside e-learning modules, that can flow on to assessments. So whether assessments could also be following simple scenarios. Giving them a goal is also saying to learners, look, okay, there's something I need you to comply with. There's a standard I need you to comply with. I'll tell you what that standard is. I'll give you some materials towards that, but we're going to do some assessment on that competency or on that standard. And so telling them what that is, giving them the goal in mind, then aligning workplace activities to those. And if I can just again use a practical example for a supermarket recently who needed their people to comply on use of knives, as you can imagine, health and safety issue. So learners were given the goal, the operation procedure to which they needed to adhere. They were given some videos to watch. They were given a learning module on how and why it was important. They were then given coaching. So they would work with a supervisor who would observe them as they were practicing and could ask questions. And then a manager would observe that behaviour and sign off that they had met that compliance goal. So I think more broadly about what is the goal for your compliance and aligning all of your learning blend around that. So the third point really is around, again, what you guys were answering in the beginning around this being, compliance often being around changing behaviours and a change message. So certainly that came through really clearly in the Insights interviews that we said, well, look, we need to find ways that we can support learners through a change process. Again, some of the models that have been coming out a lot around the blended space, I think in particular the 5 moments of learning, has been really helpful in saying to us, look, you know, learning is not a thing that just happens in an event, in a classroom event or some pre-course or, you know, during that e-learning module and that's the end. It's about recognising that learning is a journey. It could be quite a long journey or it could be a shorter journey, but it is a journey. And understanding that learners need different things at different times. So if I am learning something for the first time, I will probably kind of need a module. But sometimes over time, while I'm practicing and applying, I might need to be reminded of things. And I'm going to need some different things along the way. So one of the themes very much that we've been seeing quite a lot of in the blends is what's called campaign-based learning and thinking beyond the event. And this is about kind of applying a little bit of marketing theory into our blended learning. So thinking about how can we sustain messages over time? How can we be creative? Ads aren't always the same and they don't come through in the same media. So using a range of physical media, digital media, practical and tangible things to create a little bit of that campaign. And here's an example of a piece of learning designed around a movie theme. So again, the campaigns you can see, it really lent itself to having something fun going on around this organisation. So video promotions, hamming up the characters in it, posters and flyers. They had branded sweets, themed cafeteria menus, competitions, tip sheets, and at the bottom of the list, yes, some e-learning. But you get the idea that this is creating a little bit of buzz around the organisation. And certainly these would not be things that would happen in 1 week of the year. These are things that can be rolled out at different times and across different platforms. So really, again, this message about sustaining change. And again, critically is thinking about as a compliance program, as a change management program. And I'm sure any of you involved in any change management programs understand the real breadth that we need to think about when we're looking at a change program. So thinking about the change in the culture, in particular in relation to compliance, is often a cultural issue. It's not necessarily just a skills and behaviour, but a culture change. So again, if we think about that with that lens, we might start thinking about some different elements. And here are some quite interesting stats, and I guess one of the key things that we're starting to understand is very much about the role of the manager. So if you look at those 3 statistics there, I'll just give you the seconds to just have a quick read. And point you in particular to number 2. And number 2 is interesting that, this is talking about misconduct allegations, but really anything to do with compliance. It's the frontline managers. It's our mid-tier of managers who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. A lot of stuff is coming in there. And then when you look at the bottom statistic, you say, well, half of them feel very uncomfortable about dealing with that. And so again, in us thinking about compliance and changing a culture and how we can kind of sustain change, our middle managers become really, really important. And again, what some of that research said was, a lot of companies have, whistleblower helplines or materials and channels for which they can address any kind of observed misconduct, but they're not used. And that actually, this is where middle line managers are really receiving many of those concerns and flags. So coming out of that is we need to get managers involved and we need to give them support. And so that's very much about thinking about those situations where the manager, frontline manager, this lovely lady, has just received a serious complaint violation and she's thinking, what do I do? How do I resolve it? Oh, could I just run away and hide from it? Probably. Gosh, how do I feel about that ethically? Is this right or wrong? And what is she going to do? So what we're trying to do, I guess, in a blended compliance program is trying to support the managers through what are quite difficult and challenging issues. Now, invariably, that means a little bit of upskilling for our managers. We can't always assume that our managers do have the skills to be able to deal with that. And again, thinking around the blend, what we see quite a lot are certainly guides or a focus on purely managers. That might be online forums or face-to-face forums. Certainly workshops is often required. It may be wikis where people can look up answers to key questions or situations. It may be peer support networks, whether those are online or face-to-face, where they can actually seek support. It may be coaching or advice and support from their HR function. So whatever that is, think really carefully about how you can support your managers through the compliance blend. So again, you know, manager guides, checklists. Again, it's about tailoring to what your managers actually need. Many are, I've got so much going on, just give me a thing that I can tick off. And invariably we're seeing quite a lot of the manager tools are face-to-face and paper-based. And an example here where we were supporting the managers, showing them the whole blend, telling them what the staff capabilities are, giving them some tools in which to do some assessment, giving them a lineup of the types of activities that they could help to support their staff. So, in summary, hopefully we've brushed the little surface of what makes good compliance blended programs. Picking up on those kind of 3 points is looking to try and position your program in the right way, to design it well in a way that's really engaging, and to make sure that your program is thinking about a sustainable change in your organisation. So I will at this point really throw over to any questions. We've only got a few minutes left, but we don't have any questions posted up, so if anybody has any burning questions, then feel free to fire those through now.
Tina?
Go for it.
So we have a question from Jason. And he wants to know, do you think forums integrated via an LMS portal is a good way to engage people regarding compliance, or do you think that's too informal for a formal topic such as compliance?
Oh, yeah, I think, look, you know, the medium that your organisation use is really hard for anybody to say, because it very much depends on your organisational fit and your culture and your use of those types of tools. I mean, I certainly think there is a trend towards using more of those. They are tools that people are using out in their everyday lives. I think it's been slow pick-up for organisations to start using forums, and a certain nervousness by L&D departments or HR departments to allow open forums. But certainly I think if that is something that culturally will work for your organisation, absolutely. Certainly seen that benefit of getting people's voice out, those people that may not necessarily want to ask a question in a face-to-face forum. So certainly I think it's one of your tools, and it may not be the only tool. I'd certainly say you supplement it. But as I say, I think it's about designing to what your managers and what your organisation needs and wants, and what systems you've got. Are there any other questions? I'm just looking, there's a question here. I see there's a question from Jeff. Can we pre-test or post-test for compliance? Well, the short answer to that is absolutely you can. In fact, it's a very smart idea. And again, what we see and what we sort of talked about earlier was that learner fatigue. That many organisations, because they're driven by tick the box, tend to push all of, you know, you start at a bank, for example, and you have hours and hours and hours of learning that you need to do. Now, if you come from another bank, I would assume that much of that you don't need to work through. So any kind of pre-assessment is really useful for compliance, again, as long as you can ensure you're meeting the requirements of the compliance that is needed. I'd certainly say it's, and it's not just around compliance, it's any type. Post-testing for compliance, I guess you're talking about something outside the learning world, and again, yes, we're certainly seeing a lot of that blend is bringing us back to people and behaviour, because there's only so far that we can go in an online forum, and that's really where we need people and observation and actual behaviour for us to actually test compliance. But again, lots of online ways that we can do that. I think video has huge implications for us in terms of assessing compliance. Why do I need somebody to sit in a room to learn about fire safety regulations if they could actually demonstrate something for me, demonstrate how to use a piece of equipment that they knew how to use, or use a knife, as I've suggested. So I think there are lots of different ways that we can do it, but thinking about 70-20-10, we need to start moving that into on the job. And certainly looking at those types of tools, whether that's pre or post, that we can do on the job.
We have another couple questions coming through, Tina, if you have a little bit more time.
Yeah, no problems.
Okay. So Matt wants to know, what are some tips to avoid talking down to the learner and treat them as adults?
Yeah, great one. Again, getting the right tone is really important, and only you will know the language of your organisation. I think some of the mistakes that are being made when that comes up is people will tend to say, I assume my learners don't know anything. And often they are pretty smart. So one way you can do it is actually just not presenting a whole lot of content to them. Maybe just ask some questions and provide some light remedial feedback instead of just present and then ask a question. The other way is through that pre-assessment. Actually think about chunking your content in a way that if somebody knows something or can demonstrate the capability that you want to test, then allow them to skip that content altogether. So that means you're a little bit more tailored. And I think finally, it's often the language and the talking down happens because our SMEs, who are often not the learners themselves, in fact, by virtue of being a SME, they are not the learners. And they tend to be talking, and I'll take legislation as a good example, often the lawyers who know the words and are very risk averse and are used to dealing with lawyers. And I think our job as instructional designers is to interpret from our SMEs and get the language right. And that is really, really hard because we need to balance making that message accurate and correct for our SMEs, but also in a language and in a way that is understandable for our learners. And I would say there's no easy answer to that other than doing a bit of testing, getting learner focus groups to help provide some, feedback back to a SME who might say, oh no, we've got to have this very long, complicated language. I think keeping your writing short to the point, try to only keep a couple of messages on screen, less words, then we don't get so caught up in speaking down to learners.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tina. We have no more questions, so I think we should wrap this up. We've gone a little bit over, so thanks to everyone who's still sticking around till the very end. Just as a reminder, we will be sending a webinar recording and slide deck shortly. And just as a reminder, Kineo, including Tina, will be at the eLearns conference in Auckland, July 22nd to the 23rd, where Tina is actually presenting on Blends at Work for onboarding. And we're going to be giving away some really great Blends at Work guides, including our compliance guide that we showed a little bit earlier. So you can get your tickets to the event, and hopefully we'll see you there, even if you're Australia-based or whatnot. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions that maybe you didn't get around to asking us, feel free to email myself or Tina. It's tina.griffin@kineo.co.nz, and we'll endeavor to answer those questions for you. Thanks again, Tina, for presenting today.
Great, and thank you all, and thanks for the good questions.
Perfect. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day, and thank you again for attending.